Hello, my name is Eric Young. I'm a QSide Research Fellow, and it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Anne Marie Nunez, Professor of Educational Studies at The Ohio State University. She'll be presenting on data to advance equity in education.
Can everyone see that? Is that working? Great. Well, thank you all so much for inviting me to be here. It's been great to learn along with you all. I am relatively new to this topic. And so I'll talk a little bit about my journey in this arena and different aspects of education that are critical to think about right now for advancing equity when we consider how data are applied. My research, I first started out, I'm a professor of higher education. And so I started out researching the educational trajectories of students with different social identities, particularly Latinx, first generation college going students, immigrant students, and English learner students. And doing large scale quantitative studies of those populations really brought me to inquiry using the lens of intersectionality that I'll turn back to, just to recognize the diversity within these populations. Another area has been the role of post-secondary institutional diversity in the US and how it can provide educational opportunities for diverse groups, including the role of community colleges, transfer pathways, broad access institutions, and accountability for post-secondary institutions. And then I also started to study how to foster equity-oriented climates in STEM fields. And I first started out doing extensive research in geoscience, including ethnographic research on geoscience fieldwork and implications for inclusion and exclusion. And now I am working with, this asterisk illustrates how I've been working toward the intersection of all of these areas. Because right now I'm working with a large scale, like Hispanic serving institutions, for those of you who aren't familiar with them, are institutions that enroll at least 25% Hispanic undergraduate students, and they are federally designated by the federal government. And so I've been working with a network of 40 of these institutions in the field of computer science to raise Latinx attainment. And so I will circle that back to that a little later. As I was really trying to, one of the things that I found when I was conducting research about inclusive STEM environments is that it's very, very valuable to situate that research within the discipline. Sometimes folks in my field of higher education they just kind of look at STEM and, in general, and they don't really look at the discipline. And so I really started to read more about computer science and technology so that I can understand the disciplinary environment. And so as I began to read, I saw how technology could perpetuate inequities in education. And so these are just three recent headlines. Major universities are using race as a high impact predictor of student success. And what that means is in a particular application that many universities are using in advising, they use race to assess the risk that a student will drop out of a major. And one consequence of that has been that it disproportionately assigns Black and Hispanic students a higher level of risk at dropping out. And that can potentially lead advisors to steer Black and Hispanic students away from STEM fields, because thinking about the issue of accountability, higher education institutions really want students to finish. The second is UT Austin's own computer science department found that it was, they were using an admissions algorithm for its graduate school. They found sources of bias in the machine learning system, and so they stopped using it. And then finally, even after graduating from the university or from college, a new report frames educational redlining as this, this way in which some financial lenders are using the post-secondary institution that a student graduated from as an indicator of risk for whether or not they will pay back a loan. And two types of institutions that are disproportionately assessed as having high risks are historically Black colleges and universities and Hispanic serving institutions, these minority serving institutions, which so a consequence is that students who attend those institutions, holding other factors constant, will get charged more for loans than students with other characteristics that are similar but attended other institutions. And so again, that perpetuates, even in the loan arena after college, bias against Hispanics and Blacks in particular in these examples. So in learning about these, that led me to read about Black feminist applications to the field of technology. And these two sources were referenced earlier, Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Noble and Ruha Benjamin, Race After Technology. And so just learning a little bit more about the sources of these kinds of bias. And so I had already been in my other work conducting research on intersectionality as it relates to Latinx populations, in particular, looking at the diversity within that population and accounting for that diversity when examining Latinx experiences and outcomes. The application of intersectionality draws on a Black feminist lens, and I've included 3 references here. And it's important, you know, in really recognizing the role that Black women have had in terms of the advocacy around algorithmic bias. And you know, here, Patricia Hill Collins and Sirma Bilge talk about centering Black women's perspectives as ways of generating new knowledge and awareness. Kimberly Crenshaw, she conceptualized kind of a multi-level, rather than single access conception of identity and how that affects legal opportunities. And Angie Hancock really stresses the importance of stewardship in this kind of arena. An intersectionality lens emphasizes the role of interlocking systems of oppression and the role of multiple and privileged and marginalized identities, but also social transformation to advance equity. And so I think it was last week, the Coded Bias documentary on Netflix got released with a lot of these leaders in revealing the algorithmic bias, including Joy Buolamwini and others. And Kimberly Crenshaw herself organized an African-American policy forum that took place earlier this month. And I put the link here for those of you who might be interested, that involved several of these activists, and this was called the Coded Bias Talkback. So for those of you who are interested in that. In terms of thinking about the application of intersectionality to Latinx populations when thinking about data, Latinx, it's now like the largest population of color in the US. Almost 1 in 5 people are Latinx. It's also a diverse category, and it's only been a socially constructed category that is less than 50 years old. The 1980 census was the first census to count Hispanic origins. And some of the dimensions among which Latinx vary in terms of their educational experiences and outcomes and other areas include gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, where they come from in terms of the nation of origin, or whether or not they're from the US, whether or not they are migrant workers, for example, or they're immigrants, and finally, whether or not they speak English as their first language. And so non-visual structured data like that's used in those examples that I gave earlier, that doesn't account for this kind of diversity and isn't really sort of thinking about the complexity, in this case, of Latinx populations, it can perpetuate bias involving negative life consequences in terms of admissions, analytics that are used for advising, and loans. So I'm going to turn a little bit to the role of education in the computer science arena as a potential source of why it is that there is such bias in algorithms, in addition to knowing that they are shaped by humans who already themselves carry bias. A colleague of mine came to me doing a study, and he showed me this data. And this is from an op-ed piece that we published a month ago. And he was looking at tracking over 4 years, so looking at students at year 1 and year 4, how they scored on a measure that he and his colleagues called global citizenship. And so it was a series of attribute statements, including, I'm doing better things. I'm working to learn about the global issues and culture. I'm doing my best to improve the world, and measures like that. And so as you can see in this chart, most majors improve over 4 years. But some don't. And computer science majors not only didn't, but they decreased in terms of their scores on this major after 4 years of college, and they also decreased the most. And so this may raise some questions as to, if those are the kind of graduates that are going in and creating algorithms, for example, might that be one area to pay attention to, really? And so what I'm turning back to is what might be ways to increase global citizenship or cultural awareness. And so this network that I've been working with, called the Computing Alliance of Hispanic Serving Institutions, that's been around about 15 years, is a network of 40 Hispanic serving institutions. And then also they partner with industry, with nonprofits, with Google, basically other industry and nonprofit partners. And so they have the goal of serving as a voice for Hispanics in computing, to shape policy and discourse about these issues, and to raise the Latinx share of computing credentials in the US to 20% by the year 2030. And right now in the US, the share is about, the share of Latinx among all bachelor degree recipients in computer science is about 11%. So that's a pretty bold goal. Among many of the practices they use, which I'll talk a little bit about in the next slide, but I think is important for this particular context, is that they use the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine recently had a forum that discussed the importance of race-conscious policies in promoting equity in STEM fields, and the importance of using race data in race-conscious ways. So a lot of times when institutions are monitoring, say, persistence and attainment, they're not disaggregating by race. And so it's hard to identify, let alone address, equity gaps. But what CAHSI does is it is looking at, for example, do our computer science departments, is the share of Latinx representation the same as the share of Latinx representation in the entire institution? Are those at parity? And then above and beyond that, because of there's, let's see, only about 18% of, in the most recent data of bachelor's degree recipients in computing were women. And so the issue of gender here, again, this raises the importance of intersectionality. They also look at gender disaggregation within race in order to be able to track where their gaps are, and then they're meeting, right, in terms of professional development, and try to come up with strategies, learning from other institutions that might be doing better about how to better serve their students. And their equity-oriented practices, which they call signature practices, include culturally relevant assignments and events. So for example, include programming in a way that might generate Spanish, right? Or events that might be a Dia de los Muertos event that would celebrate famous Latinx computer scientists who have passed on. Building community through intergenerational collaborative research groups, peer-led team learning and tutoring, affording students and funding students to go to conferences that are geared toward Latinx and women, and socialization through opportunities to pursue internships and courses. And so this provides students with access to role models, with positive, supportive experiences that can really challenge some of the broader culture of computing that historically has been shown to be very exclusionary toward Blacks, towards Hispanics and women. And so this, this article was in the New Yorker about a couple months ago, who should stop unethical AI? And I just included it here because it really struck me about the challenges between of engaging, say, social scientists and bringing in some of these social context considerations into the development of technology. And since I've been working directly with computer scientists, a lot of times I might be the only social scientist in the room with computer scientists, this really caught my eye. And so, I mean, these guiding questions in terms of thinking about how to infuse AI and machine learning and the development of algorithms, these questions sort of are drawn from the work of Emily Bender and colleagues and Rua Benjamin. What's the purpose of the technology? Should it even be created in the first place? How can a data set be created to minimize bias? What are the limitations and possibilities of a data set? How to analyze data sets so that they minimize bias, and how can findings be interpreted and applied to minimize bias? And these may seem like straightforward questions, but I think the field's only at the beginning of really being able to grapple with them. And I think that that's, what that article that I just referred to really brought up. And so in terms of just recommendations, the first would just be to infuse computer science and technical education with social science awareness, social science scholarship about the context that might affect how the algorithms are constructed. The second is to connect insights from social science with the direct development of algorithmic technologies to minimize bias, and to facilitate critical conversations and build shared language between social scientists and computer scientists so that the algorithmic bias can be mitigated. And that's been a really interesting area for me to participate in because it isn't necessarily straightforward. There's just very different ways of seeing the world. But the more that there can be these kinds of conversations and spaces, the better. So I really welcome the opportunity to be here, and thank you all so much. I did include references, and so I'll just go through those, and then I will just thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Nunez. Hopefully we have a couple questions coming in from the audience, but that was super interesting. I have a couple questions of my own too, if we don't, but.
So Eric,
do you have any?
Good one.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I can jump in. So thank you so much, Dr. Nunez. It's really and I see a ton of overlap with our last speaker. And this is something that is very sort of close to my heart, that sort of AI bias and the AI being constructed by people, right? And so the outcomes of sort of those biases. I wonder, have you thought about engaging with folks who are in this industry, like in the Silicon Valley, folks who are sort of at the cutting edge of this? Because it seems to me that the harm may be done, right?
Right.
Because these are being built now,
right?
And there could be a more urgent need. So I'd just love you to speak to that a little bit.
Well, yeah, and that was what motivated us to write that op-ed, right? Because we had seen the firings at Google, right? One of the papers I cited was co-authored by two people at Google who have since been fired for, generating these ideas. And so I think you're right. I think it's actually very urgent. And that's part of the reason why when I read it, I started to really learn more about it. So I am working on a large scale NSF grant right now. And in my work with computer scientists, we've actually yesterday submitted a grant. We don't know whether or not it will get funded, but to really to work on some of these issues with, a key objective being to connect social science and computer science. But through this Competing Alliance of Hispanic Serving Institutions. They have partnerships with Google, and there is apparently that op-ed made it into the hands of Google. So there may be, the possibility to speak with people at Google through this partnership that we already have, a connection with partners in industry. So I do foresee opportunities to discuss these issues with some of the industry partners as well as those in post-secondary education. But I really think that after what happened at Google, like with those firings, the role of independent higher education is becoming, I think, even more important for being able to address justice in terms of the use of data.
Yeah, that's a really good start, I think. As a follow-up to that, one person is requesting to disclose which op-ed co-authors were fired from Google. I think they're just looking for a follow-up to that.
Oh, sure.
If you know.
Yeah, Timnit Shabru. This was in December 2020, and on the article itself, I think the name of the person is Margaret Mitchell, but on the article it says Schmargaret Schmitzel, because in terms of just challenging and rejecting, I think, Google's reluctance to be able to accept those ideas and engage with them, really, at least in that particular setting.
Yeah. Do you see a role for some development of ethical training and education for computer scientists?
This is a really good question. I think a lot of what I do know from having worked with a lot of computer science professors is that a lot of departments have classes in ethics. Some of the departments require, I think through their accrediting agency, some of the departments require that students take at least one class in ethics. But what the computer scientists who are really interested in these issues and who think they're a big problem say to me is that it's too often, because it's a separate class, it's not interwoven with a lot of the other curricula that the students study. And computer science is a really prescribed curriculum. As Amy Webb, who writes about technology, has said, there are not necessarily a lot of electives. So, if anyone wants to recommend, they take a lot more liberal arts classes, sometimes there's not that space. And so that's one of the things that some of my computer scientists have been working with in this project. We do want to explore possibilities to weave social science context more directly into multiple classes rather than have it be, separated.
Yeah, that seems like a more realistic solution rather than lumping in another requirement onto probably an already difficult, busy degree. Do you think there is such a thing as ethical AI when personal bias is reflected in that creation? Like, is that even possible?
I think that's a really good question. I think just based on, the literature about bias and stereotypes and prejudice, I don't think anyone is immune to that, even on the human level. That it's, as some people talk, in terms of culture, it's like the sea that we swim in, and it can be hard to see out of it. And so I think, as was said earlier, it's already become a big problem. And I think what the word that we seem to be using a lot, at least in the project I'm working on, is more like mitigating rather than preventing. In a way, it's sort of acknowledging the context of bias, but at least doing that in a way such that we look for the sources and see, like, at least how do we account for, some of these variables that might be being ignored.
Yeah, you got to measure it before you can fix it. Awesome. I think that's our last question, but we can continue this in the breakout room.